Tasmania's forests are incredibly beautiful, and stepping into a forest like this is a really special experience. There is nothing quite like walking beside trees that tower 80 metres above the forest floor. These giant trees are not only awe-inspiring, they do something really important. They store carbon. Lots of carbon. Tasmania is home to some of the most carbon-dense forests in the world. But these forests are being logged, which releases carbon into the atmosphere. But exactly how much carbon dioxide is being emitted when these trees are logged? And what would happen if these forests were protected and were allowed to absorb and store carbon as they grew? Could protecting our forests be the ultimate natural solution for climate change? My name is Annie, and I care deeply about climate change. The climate crisis is upon us. Bushfires, floods, and heat waves are becoming more frequent and intense. I feel deeply connected to Tasmania's wilderness, especially our forests. One thing that I worry about is how climate change will impact Tasmania's environment. We are so lucky to have so many unique wild places. But will they be safe under a changing climate? And will we be safe? I am deeply concerned about my future and the future of the next generation. What kind of world will they be inheriting? This is why I feel it is so important that we act on climate change now. I want my nieces and nephews to experience the same wonderful world that I have enjoyed. My love of Tasmania's wild places has led me to be involved in helping to protect forests like these. While learning about these incredible places, I would often hear about how important forests are for the climate. This got me thinking, if forests are important for the climate, then how much carbon is actually getting emitted when we cut these trees down? But first off, let's have a rundown on how forests interact with the climate.
Forests are super important for climate change as they draw carbon down from the atmosphere and store it long term. However, they can also be a source of carbon if they are cut down. Let's have a look at this in a bit more detail. First up, forests can absorb carbon from the atmosphere. Forests are really good at drawing down carbon from the atmosphere. If we protected all the world's forests, we could draw down a third of the carbon needed to limit warming to 1.5 degrees. Secondly, forests store a lot of carbon. So all that carbon dioxide that the trees are drawing down from the atmosphere, well, forests can store that carbon long term. If forests are left undisturbed, they can actually store this carbon indefinitely. And finally, forests can be a source of carbon. When forests are logged or cleared, the carbon stored in the forest gets released back into the atmosphere. This can cause a huge amount of emissions. In fact, around 12% of global emissions are from logging and land clearing, which makes it the third largest emitting sector after energy and agriculture.
In Tasmania, we're really lucky. Our forests are truly unique. They are home to the tallest hardwood trees in the whole world. Eucalyptus regnans can grow up to 100 metres tall. Walking amongst these giants, it's hard not to be overwhelmed by their incredible size. Giant trees like this one store a lot of carbon. And this is why Tasmania is home to some of the most carbon-dense forests in the world. We are so incredibly lucky to have forests as grand as these. Sadly, lots of our pristine forests are being destroyed. Many people would be shocked to find out that Tasmania still logs our old growth forests. This giant was logged only a few years ago. And this giant tree that I'm standing next to right now, it is due to be logged. This forest is ancient, and it has taken centuries to accumulate the carbon it stores. But once this forest is logged, most of the carbon will be released back into the atmosphere. So if Tasmania has some of the most carbon-dense forests in the world, the emissions from logging them must be pretty huge, right? Before we answer that question, we'll need to understand where the carbon goes when the forest is logged.
So when we log a forest, a large amount of the biomass, roughly 50%, is left on the forest floor. That's the tree heads, the lateral branches, the bark. And a lot of that material is then burnt in a regeneration burn, which releases large amounts of carbon emissions to the atmosphere. The remainder undergoes accelerated decomposition. In addition, much of what comes out of forests are wood chips and paper pulp, and those don't last long in the carbon cycle and also contribute significantly to carbon emissions.
So let's look at what exactly happens when a forest in Tasmania gets logged. After logging, around 50 to 60% of the biomass gets left behind on site. This is piled up into huge mounds and burnt, which releases carbon immediately into the atmosphere. However, only about half of this biomass is burnt. The rest is left behind to rot, which can take decades to release its carbon. Of the wood that's removed from the forest, the vast majority is turned into wood chips or pulp for paper. Now, this accounts for around 24% of the forest biomass, and it goes into making temporary products such as paper and cardboard. These products have a very short lifespan, and the carbon is often released back into the atmosphere within a few years. A further 10% of the forest biomass is mill waste, which is often burnt and releases carbon back into the atmosphere. This means that only 6% of the forest carbon ends up in long-term timber products that are used for making furniture and housing. These products have a longer lifespan, but on average it's only about 50 years. And that's not much compared to a forest which can store carbon for centuries. The reality of native forest logging in Tasmania is that the majority of the forest ends up as wood chips or waste. This means that the vast majority of the forest carbon is released back into the atmosphere, which is contributing to the warming of our planet.
One of the biggest problems with native forest logging is the massive amounts of waste that gets left behind. The way the forestry industry deals with this is to burn it with high-intensity fires. Now, this causes awful air pollution. It fills our skies with smoke every single autumn. This is terrible for our health, and this year in 2022, air quality in some regional towns in Tasmania were 3 times worse than the air quality in Beijing. So that leaves a really big question. Exactly how much carbon is being emitted by native forest logging each year? If Tasmania has some of the most carbon-dense forests in the world, and we are still logging them, surely it's a lot. Especially now that we know that the majority of carbon is being released into the atmosphere when a forest is logged. Well, it turns out that this is a really hard question to answer. This is all due to the way that emissions are reported.
One of the big problems in forests is the way that we do carbon accounting. We tend to net out everything rather than understand how much we're seeing from emissions when we log the forest versus how much is being stored extra when the forest is growing. And what that does is it masks just how large the emissions are when we log the forest. So we need to make sure that we break that apart so we can see how much is being stored through extra growth and how much is being emitted from logging native forests.
I recently crunched the numbers on how much emissions were coming from native forest logging. What I found is that the industry's emissions are approximately 4.5 million tonnes of carbon dioxide per year. To put that into perspective, it's the same annual emissions as 1.1 million medium-sized cars, and it's also equivalent to around 500,000 return flights to London from Australia. This makes native forest logging the highest emitting industry in Tasmania. I was completely blown away when I found out this figure. I mean, native forest logging is the highest emitting sector in the state. How did we not know about this? And why is the government not doing anything about it? Forestry is putting a lot of money into selling itself as a clean, green, climate-friendly industry. And that's just a complete lie. It's total greenwashing. It's like the coal and oil companies trying to mislead the public on the impacts of fossil fuels.
Native forest logging is the largest emitter in the state of Tasmania. 4.6 million tonnes of carbon are being released by the industry every year. Giant trees like this one are being logged, and carbon that has taken centuries to accumulate gets released back into the atmosphere. Beautiful forests like this are being completely destroyed. And for what? A very small amount of usable timber and temporary products like paper, which quickly end up in the bin. The thing that I find so frustrating is that the forestry industry claim that native forest logging doesn't produce emissions, because the regrowing of forests will absorb the lost carbon. And while yes, this is true, forests are regrown after logging, the fact is that it can take decades or even centuries for the regrowing forest to capture the lost carbon.
Once logged, forests are often put into short logging cycles of about 40 to 80 years, and the original amount of carbon is never recovered. These forests will only ever store a fraction of their potential carbon if they're continually logged. So when a forest is logged, the majority of the carbon is emitted within a few years. The regrowing forest will take decades to centuries to recapture that lost carbon. This creates a huge deficit. We need to stop emissions now if we want to limit warming to 1.5 degrees. This and the next decade are really important. We simply cannot wait centuries for regrowing forests to recapture carbon. We need to take climate action now. Ending native forest logging will make a massive reduction to greenhouse gas emissions.
The disheartening thing is that native forest logging isn't even important for our economy. Very few jobs are in native forest logging in Tasmania. It makes up less than 0.5% of the Tasmanian workforce. The state-run logging agency Sustainable Timbers Tasmania loses tens of millions of dollars each and every year. In fact, the agency has lost a staggering $1.3 billion over the last 20 years. That is huge. And what's more is that the industry is being propped up with our taxes. The native forest logging industry has received over $1 billion in subsidies and handouts over the last 20 years. I don't want my taxes going towards funding the most polluting industry in Tasmania. It just doesn't have to be like this. We can and we must do better. Native forest logging is the biggest emitter in the state. The industry is unprofitable and provides very few jobs. But the good news is that it doesn't have to be this way. If we ended native forest logging, we could prevent massive amounts of carbon from being released into the atmosphere. This could make a significant reduction in carbon emissions. What's more, Tasmania's forests could become a valuable tool to help absorb carbon from the atmosphere.
What we see, for example, in places like Tasmania, is that when the export woodchip industry was stopped, the amount of carbon emissions declined dramatically. In fact, so much so that Tasmania essentially became carbon negative. An extraordinary result.
Tasmanian forests absorb a significant amount of carbon, around 22 million tonnes a year. Now that's enough to offset the state's entire emissions. Tasmania is actually one of the few jurisdictions in the world to become carbon negative. And this is all because our forests absorb more carbon than the state emits. But this wasn't always the case. In previous decades, when logging was much higher, Tasmania had higher emissions. Due to a downturn in the industry and changes in legislation in 2012, the amount of logging halved and 500,000 hectares of forests were protected. Now, this dramatically reduced Tasmania's emissions.
So with this simple action of halving the amount of logging and protecting large areas of forests, Tasmania was able to become carbon negative within a very short period of time. By protecting trees instead of logging them, they can draw carbon down from the atmosphere and store it long term. Imagine how much carbon we could absorb if we ended native forest logging altogether.
If the forests currently managed for logging in Tasmania were protected, they could draw down 75 million tonnes of carbon by 2050. Now that's a huge amount. It's equivalent to taking every single car in Australia off the road for an entire year. Or it's the same as converting 250,000 homes to solar.
So we know from environmental accounting that's been done is that the value of the carbon from native forests far exceeds the value of the wood chips and paper pulp and timber. So if that resource is worth a lot more, then you need a workforce to be able to manage that resource and to make sure that it continues to accumulate and store more and more carbon. Now, to do that, we have to do several things. We need an elite force of firefighters. We also need to tackle problems, for example, with feral animals like deer that can impair the process of forest growth and regeneration. There are also places where forests could be that aren't at the moment, so there's a workforce needed to re-establish forests in those areas. And so you can see that there's opportunities for additional employment in better jobs, longer lasting jobs that will help not only tackle climate change, but help transition into other sources of employment in regional Australia, where forests are a really important part of the environmental fabric of the landscape.
Logging our native forests is not essential to the economy, and there are much more sustainable solutions for employment for our regional workforce. Native forest logging is also not essential for wood supply. More eco-friendly and sustainable alternatives already exist.
So if we don't log native forests, where are we going to get our wood? And the answer is from plantations. We know that when we look at the carbon emissions profiles, we can see that it's far better for climate change mitigation to source our wood from plantations Already in mainland Australia, 88% of all sawn timber in New South Wales, 88% of all sawn timber in Victoria already comes from plantations. That's where you get the highest value for that natural asset.
So here we have it. Ending native forest logging could be a really great natural solution to climate change. By protecting our forests, we can reduce emissions and draw lots of carbon down from the atmosphere. Protecting our forests makes economic sense. There are plenty of jobs in sustainable forest management, and our timber needs can be easily met by plantations.
The best way to tackle climate change is to make sure that we store as much carbon as possible in the land sector, and the best way to do that is to conserve forests and to grow existing forests through to be as old and as large as possible.
Protecting our forests is such an exciting solution to the climate crisis. Saving beautiful places like this is the biggest step Tassie can take to address climate change. By ending native forest logging, we can prevent millions of tonnes of carbon being emitted every year. And we can allow our forests to absorb carbon and store it long term. Climate change is the biggest threat to humanity and the environment. However, we are fortunate to be presented with an excellent climate solution. Protecting our native forests. But we need your help. As a community, we can mobilise and demand change. Given the state of the world right now, it is easy to feel powerless. But together, we can make a difference. There are many ways in which you can help. Join one of your local environmental groups, or if you have the ability to do so, you can also donate. Your dollars help small grassroots organisations more than you can imagine. Sign our open letter and call for an end to native forest logging in Tasmania.
One of the easiest and most effective things you can do to help our forests is to speak out. Let your local MPs and political leaders know that you want Tasmania's forests protected. Remember, your members of parliament are elected to represent you, not big business, not industry groups. So make sure you let them know about the issues that you care about.
Ending native forest logging is a cost-effective, immediate and effective solution for climate change. Together, we can make a huge difference.